OK, we've heard there from Mick Hewer of Prospect and Debbie Halsall of Unite, two trade union heads who appeared on Perspective on Sunday. Let's start with the Manx National Economic Development Forum, which I think it's now called.
Not quite. It's now called the Manx National Development Forum.
Tell us what that is and who's involved, first of all.
It's a quadripartite government, Treasury, Enterprise, Minister of Policy and Reform, I chair, chief executives in that body, plus similar status people from the trade union movement, from the Chamber of Commerce and from the third sector.
There's an assertion we heard there from Mr. Hewer that he feels his communication lines with government are reduced from perhaps how they might have been in the past. Would you think that's fair, first of all?
No. Mr. Hewer actually just mentioned then pensions as an issue. We have a technical advisory group, which is a London-based group of experts on pensions. They meet regularly with senior officers about pensions. I'm actually going to London. It's very rare that I leave the island on business. It's only, I think, second or third time to actually talk with that group in a month or so. We have very, very detailed discussions about pensions, just as Mr. Hewer said. We also have it about pay, obviously. So I never, had talked on radio about this, but at a certain time in my life, regularly was chairing discussions to put together a really brilliant public sector pay settlement for 3 years, which tackled inflation, provided certainty for members about their life and lifestyles and incomes, and also provided certainty for government about what the budget would be, assuming certain things on inflation. Beyond that, I don't think the Manx National Development Forum has been a talking shop. I think it's been instrumental since it's recreated. We created it for a year. It was my initiative to recreate it. At the end of the year, we all agreed we'd carry on with it. We haven't done anything in any way to suggest it should stop, except that in the last couple of meetings, we've expressed our disappointment that positive proposals weren't coming through from the three parties. To be fair to the trade unions and to be fair to the third sector, they've been more active than perhaps the business community has to use that forum. And to give you an example of that, the trade unions were very involved in the breakthrough we made on calculating the living wage or the living income. The trade unions were very instrumental in thinking through the issues around the local economy. Trade unions were very instrumental in working with the third sector to talk about the pay in the care sector. So they're positive things that have come from that body, and it's absolutely not government's intention to diminish that body.
What was that body in its previous incarnation, and why is it different, and how?
So, as I understand it, until 4 or 5 years ago when it was disbanded, it had become, by the end of its time, a shouting shop rather than a talking shop, where one side was criticising the other side and in response, and it wasn't really very productive. So you can only do what's inside your scope, and the way that I could recreate it was to get Council of Ministers to agree that as part of Cabinet Office we would have this quarterly reflection on the documents we were considering to try to help things for people, things for the island in general. Terms of reference are public, minutes for meetings are public. So that's what it was about.
You've mentioned case studies, pensions and to do with pay as well, two issues where you have had negotiations with trade unions. Mm-hmm. Do you think they have enough channels to communicate with government?
I think so, and also I wanted to remind the trade unionists that the Chief Minister and I regularly have seen trade unionists personally, and also we've welcomed guests from trade unions when they've come from across. So I get teased about this quite regularly, but one of the leading trade unions brought across their Northwest organiser, who, when he brought me into the conversation, called me the fixer in the Isle of Man government, which I get teased about still, and so on and so on. So I like to think that we can. What we've got in the Isle of Man is a good relationship between people and the other forces inside the economy. That is very, very important. And again, I encourage the trade unions through their representatives, but also people who are members of trade unions, and also everybody who works in private and public sector and the third sector, to think of trade unions, what they should be like for the 21st century, and not to look back to a time in the past, because young people are different, the world is different, the economy is different, and the Isle of Man is different, and so therefore we need to have the right sort of negotiation and discussion and action forum for the 21st century, not for something like it used to be in the 1980s or 90s or 2000s.
Is there still a perception that trade unions are a threat to employers and to businesses?
There could be. I can't speak for employers and businesses, but that's not how we see it in the public service.
Or how about to government then?
I don't think so. I think everybody, and I doubt very much whether they are seen, certainly in the HR departments of businesses, most businesses on the island, because ultimately everything is about people, and we've got to have good capability procedures. We've got to have good grievance procedures. We've got to make sure that equality issues inside the workplace and all that are being addressed fairly. We've got to have channels inside the workplace, and that's important to everybody wherever they work, and that's a strength of trade unionism. So I leave it at that. We've got to remember that the National Economic Development Committee goes back to the 1930s. It was biggest across in the 60s, 70s and 80s, knocked on the head in 1992. We still had it in the island in its traditional form until 4 or 5 years ago. And what I'm trying to do is work with business, the trade unions, third sector, perhaps also local authorities eventually, to put together a good forum where things could be coming forward to make things better for all of us. So, for instance, we do need to look at employment law in coming years. We now have that as a draft bill. I haven't as yet received any really positive proposal for what should be in it from the trade union side, and that disappoints me. So I hope they put something on the table from their side, and there are other things like that.
We heard extracts on Sunday from Bernard Moffat as well, former trade union leader, I suppose. He has had a long-standing pet hate, really. I think he wouldn't mind me describing it as that, of the influence of the Chamber of Commerce on government. That was reflected again by Mr. Hewer and Mrs. Halsall. To quote, the Chamber of Commerce has the ear of government, and it was quite a black and white picture painted. That he said it's us and them. Do you see that?
I don't think that's the case. I think the Chief Minister and the Treasury Minister and the Enterprise Minister and myself will get as many criticisms of what we're doing from the business sector as we do from the trade union sector. The whole of a successful society is about coming to harmony and consensus, and so therefore you have to listen, you have to take on board, and you have to try and work out what's in everybody's best interests. And people matter, and at work you spend a lot of your time and so therefore we've got to make sure we have good management, but also good relations with people. We haven't done that as well as we would like in the public service, so we're doing something about it. I'm absolutely sure in the private sector and in the third sector they would have similar concerns.
Good relations with people. So is it a symbiotic relationship with the trade unions? It
has to be, Dollin. And I've put down the frustration about employment law, and I've issued a challenge to come forward with suggestions. Another one is that when we brought in the living wage, alongside that we've got a thing called the Job Evaluation and Grading scheme process going on, and often I get frustrated how long the negotiations are taking. And from the Public Services Commission, which I chair, we got a bit frustrated sometimes that we can't improve our procedures and our documents around things like grievance and disciplinary and capability and all those other things that it's important to have agreement on.
And those are very much trade union issues.
I would very much welcome the trade unions to do everything they can to enhance the way that they help us move along things to a better place suitable for the 21st century quickly. And that's another communication which I just wanted to put on record and remind both the unions you had speaking with you that the Public Services Commission has now got a regular session with trade union leaders who have public servants involved. So that's another example of how much we respect the input and value the input from the representatives of people. But I suppose the last challenge I put to the unions, I'm sure you've got other questions and you might not allow me to read my last one, but unions haven't got the same membership as they had once upon a time. So presumably, as sort of was implicit in some of the things that your union speakers, discussants said, are not as relevant to younger people as they were to older people. And that's the challenge that I set to the unions. You've got to be addressing their issues, not just the issues from the past. And we need to put together a better industrial relations, workforce relations set up for the 21st century.
They spoke a bit about their recruitment pressures and some of the the need to keep membership drives high. So that's sort of been referenced, I think. But do you think the relationship with unions could be improved? And part of the reason I ask that is both the people I spoke to on Sunday are relatively new into their posts. So maybe that there's an opportunity perhaps for government to rekindle those relationships a bit. Do you think?
And they have been rekindled in the last 3 years, and we're moving in the right direction. And I was disappointed with the tone of the remarks. I think you perhaps took them off guard or whatever, but I would hope that the rekindling that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years continues.
There was also comment about perceptions of relative inequality on the island. This is something you're very familiar with, obviously, in terms of ongoing work on poverty, etc. There's a quote from Mrs. Halsall: "It's a daily occurrence that somebody will come and say they're struggling." And the unions, I think, to paraphrase from what they were saying, are now seeing themselves as the sort of first contact, if you like, for people who are experiencing difficulties in the workplace, which may lead to poverty issues. That's a chain that government's got to be cognizant of, isn't it? Yeah,
but let's just put our record in the forefront of people's minds when they make up their own opinions on that. The first one is that this government really has focused on poorer people and median earnings people. So, as I said to you, we've raised things like the minimum wage by a third in the last 5 years, 10% in the last 12 months. We've introduced the living wage calculation, and with the unions agreement we abolished 2 or 3 pay grades in the public service so that nobody earned lower than the living wage. As I said to you, there are some women particularly who are probably underpaid in the public service, and we're trying everything we can to finish the JEGS process so that we can reflect that. The evidence, and then in the private sector, I know that sort of process is going on has to be going on as well, because minimum wage is law. Equality Act that comes into force on the 1st of January 2020 for this sort of thing is law, and so there has to be going on outside. Otherwise, so they'll be in the tribunal before they know it. So my point is, in the public service and in the private service, we are trying to do something about making people work more. So Mrs. Halsall gave the impression that in-work poverty was increasing, and the Treasury Minister said categorically in August there's no evidence for that. We have in-work benefits. The amount of money paid out on in-work benefits has gone down, as you would expect if the minimum wage goes up and the living wage is adopted by more and more employers. Every case of poverty is tragic. It's disappointing. We've got to do something about it. But cases of poverty normally go with things like single parenthood, disability, a crisis at home, a crisis with health and mental health, perhaps physical health, something else. So therefore, we try and do everything we can through the benefit system, which is the right price for it. We try and do everything we can through social policy, and we've got such a wonderful population in the island that they volunteer, regularly, and they also give regularly. So sometimes I feel as if the GRI evidence and the food bank evidence is bigged up to get donations. Sometimes I think it's bigged up to get political ammunition to fire against government. But the way to see it is not that. The way to see it is government's doing its bit through social security and through social policy, housing policy. And the wonderful third sector is an agile, generous, extra provider in special cases, and absolutely what we need to make sure is that continues, but those people in the third sector know what to do and where to signpost, so to get a share of the 15 million we spend out on housing benefit, the tens of millions we spend on social security, and so on.
If we look at the recent examples where trade unions have come into the media spotlight, I suppose would be a diplomatic way of putting it, with the industrial action over postal services at the beginning of this year and the back end of last year. We saw some discussions with bus drivers not too long ago. There's obviously an ongoing thing with teachers and head teachers. Mick Hewer warned that there were more disputes and industrial action likely if what he perceives to be the current trend continues. Is that a view you share?
It's a possibility. So Jersey had strikes in teaching, and Jersey had strikes in the public service more generally. We didn't. We had a 3-year pay deal, which I've applauded, and I thank every public servant for making their contribution. I hope not, and I really do hope that we can build on this dialogue with you and I today, your dialogue with the unions, to make sure to remind ourselves that we're all better off if we're talking, working out consensus, working out what suits every party involved, and we don't get to the situation where we end up with strike like we did for the postal situation. And at Christmas, Manx Radio had me in, and I said I'd do everything I could to make sure harmony broke out in the postal world. We've got it has to an extent. There are still issues that are still to be settled. One of those is pensions, and another contact I have with the union is I would very much like to meet the actuaries behind the thoughts that were well developed across in terms of collective defined contribution pension schemes, because that's valuable intellectual, practical input. And I will go across to Manchester to meet the actuary involved at the same time as I'm doing something else in Manchester shortly.